All right, he likes him, supports him, wants him to win, but a White House official says that the president has no intentions of campaigning for Roy Moore in Alabama. The polls there tight as a tick right now. The two leading candidates, a Democrat and Republican, are even in what is one of the reddest of red states in this country. Of course, you know what has happened since. President Trump continued to slam Moore's opponent on Twitter, though, to former Reagan campaign manager Ed Rollins on how this all sorts out. Right now, polls show it dead even. We also know right now, Ed, there's a possibility Republicans, as soon as Moore were to get there, if he gets there, they're going to try to kick him out of there. What do you think?
I don't think they'll try and kick him out. I think if he gets elected, and it is an uphill battle, or at least a dead even battle, they're going to need his vote, and his vote's there for the next 4 years. So you're not going to go throw it out and start all over again. And when you're deciding votes like this one by 1 or 2 votes, this election is for the next 4 years. This is a guy who serves out Sessions' seat, which is 4 years.
That's right. We should explain. It's normally a 6-year term, but this is just serving out the rest of Sessions' term, right? How do you predict it will go?
I think Moore is going to win. I think it's going to be a close race, as you say. But I think at the end of the day, the voters of Alabama are conservative. Are going to say the president needs this guy. We need this guy. And there's been nothing in the last 30, 40 years. I mean, these are early, just at least the charges are allegations of 30, 40 years ago. There's no pattern. There's no, in the last 30, 40 years, he's been a very significant man in the state. So
yeah, and it looks like Republicans are giving up on that notion of special write-ins and all of this stuff because it looked like it would just fly in the face of letting Alabamans.
It's a head-to-head. You can have an Obama U.S. attorney, or you can have basically a conservative who's been a religious leader and a significant man in the state. So.
Okay. Does this boomerang, though, on Republicans nationally, though? Should he get elected? And Republicans, you've heard the whole rap, they're embarrassed to have a guy like that in the Senate, blah, blah, blah.
At the end of the day, there's a lot of people in the Senate that are embarrassing to both sides, and they still get to vote every day.
Very good point. That's a very good point. Very true. How would Ronald Reagan handle a guy like this?
I think he would have basically welcomed him. He'd have sat down, and Reagan was about friendships and having relationships. And I think he would have welcomed him. I don't think he was never anybody who condemned anybody. He never attacked anybody in the course of a campaign.
But he was stubborn, too.
He was very stubborn. Yeah. But I think at the end of the day, he understands the importance of the vote and the importance of the merits of the legislation he wanted to push through.
Speaking of legislation, Ed, the tax cut debate back and forth, indications right now it could be a tight vote. Rand Paul indicating today that when push comes to shove, it'll be a yes vote. So many we don't know. How do you think that's going to go?
There's still 4 or 5 that are out there. You have the people that are worried about the debt, and I think they do that very sincerely. There are others that you can't have a perfect bill when you're trying to put this together.
In other words, when you say worry about the debt, that will make the debt worse.
Make the debt worse, and obviously when you're adding to the debt, you still have a debt ceiling vote ahead of that, and that's.
There are a lot of cynics, as you know, who say that Senator Flake would use that as a cover. For no vote to say, I'm going to stick it back to you, Mr.
It's easy to say that, but to actually do it is another thing. I think John McCain obviously did it on Obamacare, but this particular case, this is the last chance they're going to get in this administration to basically pass tax reform. And I think it'd be hard to go back home and say, well, I didn't like the president, or I didn't have this and I didn't have that. I think at this point in time, there's still 4 or 5 you've got to bring across, but I think they'll squeak it out. And if they get it through the Senate, then obviously you got a lot of room in the conference to change.
Do you have a lot of room? I always wonder, because they're going to be far apart in conference. That's assuming it gets past the Senate.
At the end of the day, in conference you have the premise of we're going to have tax cuts, we're going to move legislation forward, and then it's really very skilled people that negotiate behind the scenes.
Ronald Reagan did it. I didn't know this until in retrospect and reading a lot on him, that he was very much and intimately involved in both waves of tax cuts, the ones in '81 that obviously came to fruition in '82, and then obviously the second wave, the more substantial reform in '86. And a lot of people have this idea that he was a distant, standoffish, detail-averse president. Quite the opposite.
Quite the opposite. I was there in both of those pieces of legislation. I was the assistant to the president in both the first term and the second term, and so I was in every meeting he was in, and he, he asked good questions. He knew the substance. He'd make notes. He wasn't a tax expert, but he had people around him who were. Jim Baker, obviously, having gone over to Treasury, made a big difference. He refined a bill. They had bipartisan support. They had overwhelmingly bipartisan support on this, and they knew if they didn't do it, Democrats would probably do it. So I think it was very important to get it done.
Did he have sort of uncompromisable points, if you can pardon my English here.
Well,
I'm not going to give ground on this. I feel passionate about this.
He had three things he felt very passionate about. One is he felt the defense needs of the country were significant. He wasn't going to compromise on those.
Right.
He thought taxes were way too high, and he had to lower taxes. That was the basic premise from his days as a movie star, his days of watching, learning about economics. And the third was he thought government was too big and he needed to deregulate it. Those first two he did overwhelmingly. I mean, he rebuilt the defenses of the country, which was very, very important for the last 30, 40 years. The taxes were 70% when we came into office. Obviously, they were 26 was the high when he left.
Amazing.
It was really amazing, and it really stimulated the economy. He really believed in those things.
I wasn't even born then, Ed. I just heard that it was a big deal.
It was a big deal.
Kidding. But one of the things I do remember about him is that he would listen very, very closely, and even in the Reagan diaries, it is reflections on certain uncompromisable points, or points that he wouldn't budge on. Do you think that this president has to relay that and let it be clear, on this I will not budge? One of the earliest signs President Trump has indicated, which he will not budge, is the corporate rate, bringing it higher than 20%, or delaying it beyond next year.
Those are two very important things. I would hope the president would set some lines in the sand and not move from them. Reagan always set the tracks. This is where these are my tracks, these are my things I want. I don't want any movement outside of those issues. I think the problem with Trump has been that he has bounced around a little bit. I think now that he basically has set these things, corporate tax is very, very important. This is probably more important than anything else in the sense of stimulating the economy long term, as you know so well.
If they were not to get this, Republicans were not to get this, Ed, then what?
Well, I think they basically then have a very difficult midterm election in which it's hard for them to argue that we passed hundreds of bills that don't matter to people when people think the big bills that they went after were health care and this particular one. So I think this is a very, very important bill. This is the major thing that Republicans have run on, both the Obamacare repeal and this one, probably more important to people today than anything else.
You know, and maybe while you're here, I always wanted to check you on this. I'm told that Ronald Reagan was loath to quote the stock market a lot, in fact, or brag about it. Maybe it was superstition, maybe it was just afraid that it could easily go the other way. It did in October '87. It was still appreciably higher than it was when he took office, but he was concerned about that. This president, not so much, who would argue that this president trumpeting a market that's been soaring since he was first elected and inaugurated. But what would Reagan tell him about that?
I think Reagan would basically say, you know, brag on the things that you've gained on, which we've had immeasurable gains since election a year ago, and then basically always be wary that what goes up can go down. He didn't live with the stock market. He didn't sit there every day and play with it. Don Regan, when he was the chief of staff, did, having been the chairman.
Merrill Lynch guy,
You know, he watched the stocks all the time. But Reagan himself always had kind of a sense of the body politic. He would go out and he'd talk to people in restaurants. He'd talk to people in schoolhouses. He'd watch a lot of television. He knew what the body politic was and what their concerns were. And he always wanted to make sure. And most of those people didn't have stocks. So at that point in time, he wanted to create jobs, get the economy moving again.
And he kept it simple. When it came to tax cuts particularly, he kept it very simple and clear.
He had a great mind and a great clear mind, a lot smarter than people ever gave him credit for, and a great ability to communicate with the American. He could relate to what he listened, and he could hear what you were interested in, and then he'd talk to you about those things.
One of my favorite lines he used, whether you support tax cuts or not, I believe you're better with your money than the government is with your money. And so many politicians since have said.
And the other thing he used to always say, corporations don't pay taxes. Corporations pass those taxes off to consumers.
Very good. Very good. I like my quote better, but if you want to top me on that, that's fine.
I could never top it. It's your show.
Ed Rollins, you're a gentleman, a scholar, multiple best-selling author as well, the former Reagan campaign manager.